Welcome to another episode of CPAC Live. We have a great show for you today. We're going to be talking to one of the stars of the RNC convention, one of these great people who have to wipe the sweat from their brow for a living, Scott Dane, the executive director of the Associated Contract Loggers and Truckers of Minnesota. And we're going to start off with one of our heroes, someone who fights hard for our conservative values every day on the floor of the Senate, although the floor of the Senate is a little less busy these days. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. Senator, thanks for joining us on CPAC Live.
Matt, always great to be with you. Thank you.
I assume you're in Houston, Texas.
I am. I'm home in Texas, and any day in Texas is a good day.
And I've reminded you this before, but I spent my first 8 years in Houston, Texas, rooting for the Oilers, and I still can't get used to not rooting for the Oilers.
Love you, Blue. And we had the greatest football teams we've ever had. Earl Campbell should have won it all, and then we ran into the Pittsburgh Steelers and one of the greatest teams to ever play the game. It's still heartbreaking from our youth.
Yeah, when I went to you and I were both on the presidential campaign in 2000 in Austin. And the first thing I did is I walked over to go see Earl Campbell's Heisman Trophy. I mean, that was emotional. I thought that was just so awesome to see. What a great athlete he was.
He was incredible. You remember Earl Campbell had 34-inch thighs?
Yep.
I mean, he was just, for younger viewers, it was, look, they're running backs that spin and pivot and are pretty. And what was fun about Campbell is he just ran that way. Yeah. And like 2-3 guys would tackle him, and it was just a locomotive. He'd go right through them and drag them into the end zone. It was spectacular to watch.
So, Ted Cruz, some would say that's your strategy in the Senate.
Well, sometimes, what is it Mike Tyson said? Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. Yeah, right. Knowing what you believe and fighting forward, but doing it with a smile is a pretty potent way of moving things forward. And
from what I can see, you have both your ears, which is good.
At least at the moment.
That's right. I follow you on. We were talking about how I follow you religiously on Twitter and how people get their news and such. One of the things you do very well is you got to maintain your composure, have a little fun, a little bit of snark, sometimes just throwing something out there that's a little shorter, really grabs people's attention.
Yeah, look, it's fun to engage, particularly when the left is so angry, to have fun and laugh. It's like Babylon Bee. I send a lot of things of yes. Babylon Bee around because they're funny. Like
they're good.
One that I just sent was a Babylon Bee article about how a memorial was being held for Hans Gruber, the victim of police violence when Sergeant John McClane threw him from the Nakatomi Towers in Die Hard. And it's just, it was awfully funny. And it was just, and all I did was I retweeted it and said, absolutely true.
Yeah, I have to say I retweet a lot of those. But the thing is, I think conservatives have a sense of humor. I'm not so sure many liberals do, because I do get responded to like, how dare you say this? I'm like, no, this is in jest. But when you have to say something's in jest, it kind of ruins the whole thing.
It's, given that the left is angry and shrill and it's all, you're a Nazi. I mean, that's how they say good morning. What I try to encourage, in particular, young conservatives, young libertarians, is don't respond in kind. Don't have rage on the other side. What Reagan embodied, and you and I both were inspired by Reagan as kids.
Definitely.
Was being a happy warrior, being joyful. I'm reminded of one of my favorite Reagan stories. He's governor of California. And at Berkeley, there are a bunch of protesters. And look, he was dealing with some of the issues we're dealing with now, of protesters, in some cases violent protesters. And there were the protesters and hippies, and they were chanting, "We are the future. We are the future." And Reagan was in his car. He took out a notepad, and he wrote on the notepad and held it up to the window and said, "I'll sell my bonds."
That's great. You got to maintain a sense of humor, but I have to say I'm gonna be honest here, reveal something. I am a little bit sad for America. I've always believed in this idea being this Reagan idea, our best days are tomorrow. And I look at what's happening and how effectively the radicals, the socialists have woven themselves into our institutions, both public and private, and really taken so much of it over. And they've really brainwashed a couple of generations of American kids. When I was getting out of the White House the other day for the president's acceptance speech, and I had gone into those protests anonymously previously, but it's mostly white kids decked out in a lot of Black Lives Matter and other kind of radical shirts and logos, well branded, I might say. But the stuff coming from their mouth, I mean, these are not paid. They might be paid, but they're not paid for their beliefs. They really believe this crap.
Yeah. Well, did you get harassed coming out of that speech? I know a lot of people did.
We were lucky enough to get on a very secure bus, but they were surrounding the bus. It was almost like one of these, moments when you feel like you literally are in the middle of a coup. With things were lighting up around us and things were getting whacked against the side of the bus. You kind of wondered, if they could stop that bus and get inside that bus. And I actually had warned people on the White House lawn, Senator, because we could hear the protesters. I said, I hope there's a plan, because if not, some people are really going to get hurt. And I think we were very fortunate they didn't.
It was really frightening what happened there. And look, you're right. Some of the irony. I always chuckle at angry Marxist protesters who are often young white kids, and many times they're sitting there with $1,000 iPhone and a $2,000 brand new bike, saying capitalism is evil and oppressive. And I really think we ought to come and say, fine, give us your iPhone and we'll sell it and redistribute it to people less fortunate than you.
Right.
It's I remember, so you and I were both on the 2000 George W. Bush campaign, and the headquarters was at 301 Congress right in Austin. And I remember one day there were a group of protesters going by, and it was a much more mild protest than what we're seeing right now, but they were protesting the World Bank, and they were waving signs saying abolish the World Bank. And they actually went by the campaign and didn't know we were there. They were just sort of protesting generically. And I remember looking out the window and thinking, boy, if only they knew there was a Republican presidential campaign in the building they're marching past. But I also really wanted to go out with a sign that said that they were talking about the World Bank, that said their ATM fees are too high.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it was clear they were protesting, and they had no idea what they were protesting, other than they were just young and pissed off and leftists. And it is, you talked about being sad. What's happening in this country, we're being torn apart. The anger, the violence, it is accelerating to a point that I'm really worried. I'm worried that the violence is getting, and you see when people were being harassed, when, for example, coming out of the White House on Thursday, the video of Rand Paul and Kelly Paul being surrounded by that mob. And, Rand has said that they were scared for their lives. And I have been more than once in surrounded by angry, screaming Marxists with a threat of violence in the air. And I'm really worried this is going to escalate into something with potentially deadly results. We're seeing that obviously in Portland and Chicago, but I'm worried that this is going to escalate even more. And what's even more disturbing is you have Democrats who are apologists for this, who are scared to call out the Antifa rioters, who are scared to call out the BLM violence.
And what's the reason for that? Isn't it because in many ways this is animating the base of their party? There's a symbiotic relationship between these riots and protests and what Democrats realize the base of their party wants to see, which is kind of like a whole new America.
We did, as you know, I launched a podcast in January of this year. By the way, this is part of the joys of Zoom. That's my dog barking in the background.
For everyone listening, that is Ted Cruz's dog and not my dog.
whose name, ironically, is Snowflake, although he was named before snowflakes were a thing. He's just a little white furball. But I was mentioning back in January, I launched a podcast that we do every week, Verdict with Ted Cruz, and we did one on Thursday night, the night of the president's speech at the RNC. And actually, the last CPAC we did one from the stage, and it was.
I remember that. Yep, it was great.
And it was a lot of fun. So the one we did on Thursday, we got a question from the mailbag that was exactly the question you just asked, which is, why are the Democrats so afraid to call this out? And I don't know for sure. About a month ago, I chaired a hearing on Antifa violence and riots with 7 Democratic senators participate. Not a single one of them would say even one negative word about Antifa. They all had the same talking points, which is right-wing violence. It's all right-wing violence. And I said, look, when there's right-wing violence, it's wrong. Not Nazis and Klansmen are ignorant, bigoted morons. And if they commit violence, we should arrest them, throw them in jail, and leave them there a very, very long time. Will you say the same thing about Antifa and BLM? Crickets. The question of why, part of it is there's a lot of energy in their party. That's where, the people driving their party are the angry left, are the AOCs and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warrens of the world. Part of it is, I think, sort of a cynical sense of some Democrats that the worse things get, the better it is for Joe Biden and the worse it is for Trump. That if the world has gone crazy and it's terrible, that they think that helps them politically. And then I also think there's kind of a cultural thing that for many congressional Democrats, they sort of identify as the 1960s Berkeley protesters.
Yeah.
And so they're almost culturally unable to criticize what's happening. And this shouldn't be complicated. Free speech, yes.
No.
You have the right to say whatever you want. Violence, no. You don't have the right to attack people, to harm people, to kill people, to firebomb police cars. If you cross the line to violence, you should be stopped and stopped immediately.
Yeah, John Lewis talked to us about good trouble at a time when Bull Connor and the others, defenders and enforcers of Jim Crow, did some of the most horrific things to our fellow citizens. This just seems like trouble. It seems like a lot of young people stirring a cauldron. It's inevitably going to get out of control. We've already seen dozens of examples of people losing their lives to this violence. And I appreciate your tone of trying to get us to a place where we have political disagreements without setting people's small businesses on fire or their churches or knocking over statues.
We ought to be able to treat each other with decency. 2 things I tweeted out today were, one, a video of leftists firing fireworks at Ted Wheeler's home. I guess he lives in a condo, the mayor of Portland. And Wheeler is a hard leftist who supported all of these radicals, and yet they're mad at him too. And from the appearance of it, these are pretty serious and commercial fireworks. The video I saw online,
yes, they went quite high.
And they're firing them into this residential building. And I just asked the question, okay, why is this not a criminal offense, and why weren't these guys arrested immediately? If you're firing commercial fireworks at people's homes where they're kids, where they're people who can be harmed, why aren't they enforcing the law? And another one I just tweeted out was a different video of, I guess, the mayor of San Jose, California, where Black Lives Matter protesters were outside of his house or her house, I don't know, but were spray painting on the front of the house. I don't know what exactly they sprayed, but the first 3 letters were F, U, and C, so you could kind of envision where they were going. And it was sort of ironic that this particular mayor had in the window a Black Lives Matter sign, and it didn't matter. The mob was there. Look, terrorizing someone's home and spray painting across the front of it. I don't know if this mayor was home. I don't know if the mayor has kids. But it is targeting people in their homes, targeting small businesses. it's wrong, and we need to stand against it. And right now, so interestingly enough, in the last couple of days, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have, for the first time, come out with these kind of benign statements. Violence is wrong from everybody. Well, that's, I guess, a mild improvement, but they're still not willing to stop it. And where this violence is happening is where you have Democratic officials that are tolerating it and refusing to let the police officer arrest someone when they do it. If someone comes to your house, if someone threatens innocent people, look, every one of the people assaulting people walking out of the White House, when they were assaulting and threatening them, they should have been arrested. But the D.C. mayor doesn't want to do that.
Well, the people she's arrested, I woke up to the knowledge of knowing that 99% of the people that have been arrested for these crimes have been immediately put back on the street. Because if you can associate yourselves with the Black Lives Matter protest, that's a grievance against structural racism. So you're absolved of your individual crimes. And that's one of the crazy things. I think Joe Biden's biggest problem, Senator, is he goes to Pittsburgh. He says some of the right words, but you can't condemn violence yet completely embrace through 4 days of your convention Black Lives Matter Incorporated, which has as its number one tenet of 8 pretty terrible policy goals, defunding the cops. If you defund the cops, you get the violence. It's completely proportional.
Look, that is exactly right. And I will say police officers, I've always viewed it as an important part of my job to have the backs of cops. But I got to say, the cops right now that are in bright blue cities, whether NYPD or Portland or Seattle, we're seeing veteran cops retiring. But I wonder what 19-year-old right now wakes up and says, you know what I want to do? I want to be a police officer. I mean, it used to be kids would play and you'd play cops and robbers and you would it was a tradition of service. And one of the things that really concerns me going forward is that the people who become cops now because they want to serve, they want to protect their community, they want to make a difference, it's getting so demonized and vilified that I fear a lot of them won't make that decision. And if the only people who want to be cops are the people who want the power of having a gun, that's going to make our police forces a lot worse off rather than better.
That's right. And we've all seen good police work and we've seen bad police work. And with training and resources, these people in terribly stressful situations will make better decisions. And taking away their funding and taking away their standing and their dignity isn't going to help those situations.
It's look, also today or yesterday, we got news of a police officer in St. Louis who was doing his job, and he's African American. You know, I tweeted out this morning just his picture and the words Black Lives Matter because he's African American. And what's amazing is the rage on the left that produces. I mean it. Now I got to say, by the way, I actually think a lot of Republicans are being really foolish on the like people get asked, do Black Lives Matter? And Republicans feel like, oh, no, I can't say yes to that. I've got to say all lives matter. But my approach is absolutely yes, period, unequivocally. Black Lives Matter, period, full stop. I also think Hispanic lives matter, white lives matter. But yes, Black Lives Matter. And if you abolish the police, more Black lives will be lost. And the agenda the angry left is pushing, we're already seeing in inner cities murder rates going up, sexual assault rates going up, violence going up. And the more you prevent the police from doing their jobs, the more vulnerable populations will be the victims of violent crime. This is not helping African American community.
The Russians would use social media to destabilize America. One of the things that I said I was sad, you said you were worried. There's other words I can say, but you know, I think a lot of people that fled fascist regimes are looking at what's happening in this country, and it really scares them. And they wonder if our enemies overseas, how hard would it be for them to get on Act Blue or get on some of these finance platforms and really fund this racial animosity and the agitation and, you know, the burning down of our cities. Do you think it's appropriate for DOJ and others in positions of responsibility to see who's funding all of this violence?
Yes, 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 yes. And I have urged the Attorney General, I've urged DOJ to go after them, to get after the funding sources. A lot of it we don't know. Now, I will say, we were talking just a second ago about Black Lives Matter. There is a difference between the statement, yes, Black Lives
of course,
unequivocally, it is a truism, and the organization that is called Black Lives Matter, that has taken that name. That organization is run by people who are explicit and avowed Marxists.
That's right.
Who have a long history of supporting terrorist revolution in the United States and abroad. I did a whole podcast on going through some of the history of the founders of the organization Black Lives Matter, but also going through the funders of that organization. And they're big tech companies. They're companies like Microsoft and Amazon that are flooding cash to them. Ironically, one of the things the founders of the organization Black Lives Matter call for is a total boycott of any business owned by white people. So it's a little ironic that the Bill Gateses of the world and the Jeff Bezoses of the world are giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to an organization calling on people to boycott Microsoft and Amazon, which last I checked, neither of those guys are people of color.
Right.
So we know some of the funding.
Right.
In terms of Antifa, there's actually very little clarity in terms of, look, the internet is abuzz with George Soros is funding all of this. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, just because people say it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. But law enforcement needs to investigate where are the funds coming from that are flying people in, that are supplying the terrorists, that are supporting this violence, because there's clear money being spent and it's doing real damage.
Well, I'm going to give some of these entities and philanthropists who have bragged about, in the very beginning of this with the terrible tragedy of George Floyd's death, a lot of people rushed in to fund, not fully understanding the brazen revolutionary radicalism of the group, which I like to refer to as Black Lives Matter Incorporated, kind of like the real agitators, the real, they want to bring destabilize this country. I think some of them would take it back if they had a chance to do it again. Wouldn't it be great if people use this philanthropy to bring laptops into the inner city with kids that can't go back to schools, and help Black pastors try to help and counsel Black fathers and try to help Black families? Like, there's a real need for resources. It isn't to topple the American government. It's to actually give aid and comfort to the Black family.
Look, I agree with that. One thing that I fear, though, is I don't know that they would take it back. You saw Hollywood celebrities that were contributing to bail funds to bail out the violent protesters and terrorists that started Minneapolis, and it. I suggested at the time, how about you contribute to a scholarship fund for inner city African American kids or inner city Hispanic kids, and help them get an education and have a better shot at achieving the American dream. But for too many people, this is about virtue signaling. This is showing how pure and noble they are.
That's right.
And I don't know that there is a more preening, virtue signaling collective than professional sports right now, which seems to be each one stepping all over itself to try to alienate half their fans and lecture us simultaneously. Look, I'm watching, I'm seeing people at the NBA saying, so one shirt is vote as if your life depends upon it. I'm like, oh, okay, so you're saying vote for President Trump so the mobs don't come terrorize you at home, or is no, that's not what you mean.
Right.
There's a whole lot of money that is focused on right now destabilizing the country and trying to defeat the president. And it is willing to fund some very radical things to try to get power.
Well, in the Schlapp household, we're going to watch the U.S. Open, which has gotten started. We're watching a lot of golf, and we've rediscovered bowling. So there's all kinds of sports out there for us to kind of fall back in love with. And Senator Cruz, we appreciate your words of wisdom here today and all the great work you do. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. God bless. And thank you for everything, everyone who listens and involved in CPAC. You guys are making a difference, moving people's hearts and minds. And we've got to be smiling and preaching the power of freedom, the power of free enterprise, and the power of the Constitution. It makes a difference.
Can't agree with you more. We're going to be right back with Scott Dane from the great state of Minnesota, which is increasingly interesting politically. But when you talk about Minnesota, we first have to hear from a very interesting politician from Minnesota, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. We'll be right back with Mr. Dane after this short video.
I will never co-sign on funding a police department that continues to brutalize us. And I will never stop saying, not only do we need to disinvest in police, but we need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. The Minneapolis Police Department is rotten to the root. And so when we dismantle it, we get rid of that cancer and we allow for something beautiful to rise. And that reimagining allows us to figure out what public safety looks like for us.
Well, we've all seen the really tragic events that unfolded in Minnesota after the tragic death of George Floyd. But I think the response to all of that tragedy and the ensuing riots and destruction and crime is that the president and Republicans generally have a renewed chance to make the case to why their policies can make people's lives better. And we're now joined by Scott Dane, who gave a spectacular speech at the Republican National Convention. Scott, thanks for joining us on CPAC Live.
Thank you, Matt. It's my pleasure.
So did you ever imagine that you'd be speaking in front of like the whole world from the Republican National Convention?
No, not at all. In fact, I did do a little bit of checking on the audience size, and that 15 million people viewing was pretty intimidating. But I guess once you get past a million, what's 15 million more?
That's right. What's the big deal? Now, you were from Minnesota, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Did I mischaracterize some of the dynamics of what's going on in your state?
No, not at all. It's a tragic situation, and these situations need to be fully investigated and proper actions taken. But what's happening in Minneapolis isn't the course to address those type of situations at all.
In other words, violence, crime. We've seen murders, we've seen arson, we've seen people losing all their financial assets because of this rage that's ensued. And that makes responsible citizens of all color say, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way to solve our problems.
No question about that. They refer to outstate Minnesota as greater Minnesota. And we take that as a compliment compared to lesser Minnesota, perhaps, in the metropolitan area. But it doesn't reflect Minnesota at all, the greater part of Minnesota.
Tell us why what you do is so important and why Trump policies has helped the people you work with.
Well, in rural Minnesota, we've got limited opportunities, unlike the metropolitan areas. And we depend on mining up on the Iron Range. We depend on farming, and we depend on the timber industry for the most part. The timber industry is critical for forest management to make sure we have healthy forests in Minnesota. And so that's so important, and the president understands that. And as you look out west and the wildfires that are occurring out there, tragic situation, a loss of property and life. My youngest son is on a helicopter right now in Washington State battling those fires. That's what he does for a living and stuff. So we need to manage these forests, and President Trump understands that. He's not wanting us to go in and do anything more than the Forest Service has already identified in their plan that's necessary to sustain a healthy forest.
So it's forest management, and it's also part of that is clearing out a bunch of dead timber, but it's also the appropriate harvesting of this resource to take care of real consumers.
The harvesting of it, and one of the first things President Trump did was exactly that. He increased the removal of what we call hazardous fuels, dead timber on the forest floor. And, I want to touch upon something real fast here. He mentioned raking the forest floor.
Yes.
I've been to Finland, okay, and I've observed the forest management practices in Europe, and I was embarrassed when I compared what they did to what we do here. And when they're talking about raking the forest floor, and their forests in Finland look like parks compared to our overgrown, impenetrable forests in the United States, they're talking about using heavy bulldozers with teeth on them to take away the dead understory and that type of stuff. That's what they're talking about. It really is insulting that the uninformed media or other agenda-driven organizations would talk about getting out there with garden rakes and raking the forest floor.
Yeah, they kind of parodied him saying somehow he wanted to sweep the forest, but this is to borrow a pun, the forest and the trees. They always try to find the way in which the president or some conservative or some Republican mischaracterize some tiny little aspect of the tree. And in doing that, they are hiding the truth of the forest from those either reading or watching that news source. So you understand the intricacies of forest management. When you see what the president often calls fake news, mischaracterize his words, and then they'll call him a liar, and then they'll add it to the CNN tally of all the lies he told that day. When you actually know what's going on, isn't that infuriating?
It is. It's very frustrating to see that, and not only from forest management, from fire perspective. I've worked on wildland fires. When you go out west, you'll see logging crews participating in fighting those fires with their equipment. They're there to protect the forest. The idea of saving a tree that people all rally around, by saving a tree, they're killing the forest many times because they're not practicing forest management. It takes three elements. I was a firefighter and as well as working in the timber industry. It takes three elements for a fire. It takes oxygen, it takes ignition source, and it takes fuel. You can't take the oxygen out of the atmosphere. You can't stop the lightning strikes that are igniting a lot of these fires out west. The only thing you can do is address the fuel loads in there. And until people are willing to accept that fact and do something about it, then they're contributing to the continuation of unmanaged forests and these forest fires.
So when you're hanging out in Minnesota, talking to your neighbors and your friends, people in your community, what do they care the most about in terms of politics?
I think that probably the most disturbing thing, maybe it's because in the news right now, is the unrest throughout the country. We're somewhat immune to that in northern Minnesota in the woods. I live out on my 50 acres, and 40 acres is a normal parcel of land up here. Our subdivisions are 40-acre subdivisions up here compared to the cities. But even though it's not up here, it's very disturbing for people, and they want to see law and order restored. We respect those old-fashioned values in greater Minnesota.
And do you think that there's a chance that there are Democrats in Minnesota who believe that there's an appropriate and responsible use of our natural resources, who think that cops aren't bad guys just because they put on the badge and the uniform, that first responders are not bad guys just because the actions of a few? Do you see Democrats, because there's always been this lore of the Iron Range in Minnesota and a lot of conservative Democrats up there. Do you see a trend for them supporting the president?
No question about it. And it's got the Democratic, or what they call a DFL in Minnesota, very nervous right now, especially up in St. Louis County, the largest county in the United States east of the Mississippi. I was at an event last night that one of the 6 mayors who endorsed Trump at the Pence rally last Friday was there. And in the small town of Hoyt Lakes, where I'm talking to you from right now, that mayor came out in support of Donald Trump and Mike Pence as well. So there's been a big shift. I think that a lot of Democrats, if you will, on the Iron Range have realized that their values and their conservative positions, surprisingly, are more in line with Republicans and Democrats today.
Well, that's certainly what I think is interesting about this political time is there is a certain amount of realignment going on where kind of some of the more fancy folks, shall we say, who occupy the august spaces of the elite, who in times past would have been country club Republicans, to some extent, have been replaced with people who have to work for a living, who have to work hard for a living, who now see the Republican Party led by Donald Trump as a party that cares about the little guy, and including the immigrant who comes to America and has to work really hard to put food on the table for his or her family. Let me ask you another question about what's going on in Minnesota. Do you think that this one aspect of all these riots, of course, there's this whole problem with racial tensions in the country, but do you also think people of faith feel like they're being attacked? They see churches being burned. We've seen several churches in California, statues being toppled. Do you see that friends of yours who care about faith and those related issues also feel like somehow there's a hostility towards them?
You know, not in northern Minnesota. Fortunately, we're concerned about it in where it's happening. I don't think we're concerned about it occurring up here. We don't really have issues of.
Can I maybe posit a reason why? There's just a chance that in northern Minnesota, your First Amendment is protected because you guys also believe in the Second Amendment. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong at all. You know, I worry sometimes when I see these reports about these crazed gunmen, and they report back that they had 15 guns and 1,000 rounds of ammo. And we all up in northern Minnesota kind of look at each other and says, crap, we're crazed gunmen. No, just joking there, okay? We all, you know, cherish our Second Amendment right. When I was out in D.C. for the convention, I felt extremely uncomfortable not being able to have something with me, which we normally all carry on ourselves or in our trucks, for that matter. We would hope to never have to exercise that right at all. But like you said, there would be no hesitation in protecting our properties and our families up here.
Well, Scott Dane, you're a great American. We loved listening to you at the Republican convention. We're going to be back out in Minnesota for a CPAC. I hope you'll join us.
I would love to.
That would be great. And
keep me posted.
We will. Keep up the great work out there in Minnesota. We appreciate everybody joining us for this great episode of CPAC Live, and we'll be with you again very soon.